Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On the morning of Sunday, March 27th, 1977, four young men stood at the entrance to Indian Creek Caverns in Stone County, Missouri, about 40 miles, 64 kilometers south of Springfield. Doug Beckerdite and Gary Blades, both 20 years old. Ed Brown, also 20. And Wayne Smith, the youngest at 18. They had flashlights, one electric headlamp, and the kind of confidence that comes from not knowing what you don't know. Before entering, they did something responsible. They left a note on their pickup truck with Ed Brown's father's phone number, just in case. Then they walked the half mile from the road to the cave entrance and disappeared into the darkness. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that while they were gearing up for their Sunday adventure, something was happening in the sky above them. Rain had started falling, not a gentle spring shower, but a torrential downpour that would continue for hours, dumping water onto the Missouri landscape like someone had torn open the clouds themselves. Indian Creek Caverns wasn't some tourist attraction with paved walkways and electric lights. Locals sometimes called it Old Mud Cave, and if you knew anything about Missouri caves, you knew what that meant. This was a wild cave system, the kind where you squeeze through tight passages and crawl through mud and feel the mountain pressing down on you from all sides. The kind of place that floods when it rains. Really floods. But the four young men didn't know that. They were inexperienced. This might have even been their first time underground. So, when they entered that Sunday morning, they had no idea they were walking into a trap that was already being set. The cave system had two main levels. There were the dry upper passages, higher elevation, mostly safe from water. And then there was the stream level, the lower passages where an underground creek flowed through the limestone. The four friends made their way through the entrance. The temperature inside was probably around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to notice, but not unbearable. Not yet. They explored the passages, moving deeper into the cave. The rain outside kept falling, and falling, and falling. By Sunday evening, when they should have been emerging from the cave, heading back to their truck, maybe grabbing dinner somewhere and laughing about their underground adventure, they weren't at the entrance. They were somewhere deep in the cave system, and something had gone terribly wrong. When they failed to return Sunday night, Ed Brown's father made the call. The Stone County Sheriff's Office responded, and deputies began searching the area around the cave. The truck was still there. The note was still there. And the cave entrance, when they shined their lights into it, looked different than it should have. Water. More water than anyone expected. The cave was flooding. By Monday afternoon, with the four young men now more than 24 hours overdue, the Sheriff's Office called in Dave Neff, an experienced cave explorer and former advisor to the School of the Ozarks Troglodytes, the local caving club. Neff took one look at the situation and knew they needed a proper rescue operation. He organized a team that included other experienced rescuers and an emergency medical technician. By the time they assembled at the cave entrance at 5 p.m. Monday, the rain had finally stopped, but the damage was done. 7 inches, 18 centimeters of rain had fallen. 7 inches that was now draining into every crack and crevice in the landscape, all of it flowing underground, all of it pouring into Indian Creek Caverns. The rescue team split into two groups. The first would search the dry upper levels. The best case scenario was that the four had retreated to higher ground and were just waiting out the flood. The second team would wait for wetsuits to arrive before attempting to search the flooded stream level. At 8 a.m. Tuesday morning, now more than 36 hours after the four had entered, the first rescue party went in. The water level inside the cave was catastrophic, 5 feet, 1.5 meters above normal. Old-timers who'd been exploring these caves for decades couldn't remember the last time Indian Creek had flooded this badly. The rescuers pushed forward through passages that were supposed to be dry, finding themselves wading through chest-deep water with only 6 inches, 15 centimeters, of airspace between the surface and the ceiling. They had to tilt their heads back just to breathe. Then the passage got deeper, and they had to swim, their lights barely penetrating the muddy water. 3 of the rescuers turned back. 3 continued, pushing deeper into the flooded cave. Then at 9 a.m., only 390 feet, 119 meters from the entrance, not even a tenth of a mile underground, they found them. The 4 young men were lying together in about 2.5 feet, 76 centimeters of water, not floating, lying. And they weren't scattered or separated. They were arranged in a line. The rescuer who found them would later describe the scene in an affidavit, and what he described was so strange, so impossibly ordered, that it would haunt everyone who heard about it. The 4 were positioned one behind the other, facing back into the cave, back toward the deeper passages, away from the entrance. The man at the rear of the line had his hands clutched tight on the sides of the 3rd man at chest level. The 3rd man had his hands clutched identically on the 2nd. The 2nd man was holding the 1st man the same way. A human chain, locked together even in death. The lead man, the one at the front of this desperate line, wasn't holding on to anyone. In one hand, he clutched a pair of glasses by their bridge, the earpieces unfolded and sticking straight ahead, like he'd been holding them out in front of him, maybe trying to see better, maybe offering them to someone. In his other hand was a flashlight, and around his neck, resting on his chest, was the electric headlamp, still glowing. After more than 36 hours underground, the light was still burning. The rescuers stared at this scene, trying to understand what they were looking at, trying to piece together what had happened in this cave, in the darkness and the rising water. In those final hours, here's what Dave Neff and the other experienced spelunkers believe happened, piecing together the evidence from that terrible scene. The 4 friends had entered the cave Sunday morning, when everything was fine. They'd explored for hours, probably having a great time, going deeper into the system, checking out passages, getting muddy, getting that unique thrill that comes from being underground in a place few people ever see. But while they were deep in the cave, the water was rising. The rain that had started Saturday night was draining into the system, and the underground stream was swelling, filling passages that were normally high and dry. By Sunday evening, when the 4 tried to leave, they reached the entrance area and found it blocked. Water. Deep, cold water where there should have been a walkable passage. They were trapped. So they did the smart thing. They retreated to the dry upper levels to wait it out. They knew the rain would stop eventually. The water would recede. They just had to wait. They were cold from wading through the water, but they had lights. They had each other. They would be okay. Hours passed. Sunday night, Monday morning. They were getting colder. The cave was 55 degrees, 13 degrees Celsius, and they were wet. Hypothermia was setting in, that insidious condition where your body temperature drops degree by degree, where you start shivering uncontrollably, where your thinking gets fuzzy and your movements get clumsy. At some point Monday morning, they decided to try again. Maybe the water had dropped. Maybe they could make it. They had to try. The lead man, whoever he was since it wasn't specified in the reports, put in a fresh battery for the headlamp. This detail is crucial. A 6-volt lantern battery wouldn't burn for more than 10 hours. If the headlamp was still glowing when they were found Tuesday morning, that meant a fresh battery had been installed sometime Monday. They were preparing for another attempt to get out, but by this point, they were in bad shape. Hours of being cold and wet had taken their toll, so they made a decision. They would stay together. The person in front would lead, and the others would hold on, following in a chain, so no one got separated in the dark, flooded passages. Can you imagine that moment? The conversation they must have had. The decision to try one more time, knowing how weak they'd become, knowing the water might still be too high, but also knowing they couldn't just stay in the upper passages forever, getting colder and weaker by the hour. They started moving. The lead man went first, holding his glasses in one hand. Behind him, the 2nd man held on to him at chest level. Behind the 2nd, the 3rd, behind the 3rd, the 4th. A human chain shuffling through the flooded passages, each person holding tight to the one in front, because letting go meant getting lost, meant drowning alone in the dark. They made it to the entrance area, and the water was still there, still too deep, still impassable. They had to go back. They turned around, still holding on to each other, and started back toward the upper levels, back into the cave. But something happened. The lead man finally collapsed. Hypothermia or fatigue finally overwhelmed his body's ability to function. When he fell, the others fell too, because he was the one pulling them forward. He was the force keeping them going, and when that force disappeared, there was nothing left. They went down in the water, still holding on to each other, 2.5 feet, 76 centimeters, deep. Not even waist deep. But when you're suffering from severe hypothermia, when your body is shutting down, when you've been fighting for your life for over 24 hours in the cold and the dark, 2.5 feet of water might as well be an ocean. Their last breaths, their lungs filling with water, their hands still gripping the person in front of them, still holding on. Because even at the very end, even as everything was going dark, they refused to let go of each other. And then, nothing. Just 4 young men lying in a line in the darkness, the headlamp still glowing on the lead man's chest, illuminating nothing but muddy water and stone. When the bodies were removed from the cave by 11:30 a.m. Tuesday, the county coroner determined the cause of death was drowning. There was water in their lungs. But the experienced cave explorers knew it was more complicated than that. Yes, they'd drowned, technically, but hypothermia had killed them first, shutting down their bodies until they couldn't keep their heads above water anymore. The strange, ordered way they were found, still in a line, still holding each other, suggested they'd all died at almost the same moment, which should have been impossible, but somehow wasn't. This was one of the most haunting cave rescue scenes in Missouri history. Not because they'd been reckless or stupid, but because they'd done everything they could to survive, and it simply wasn't enough. On the afternoon of Monday, December 29th, 1980, 7 kids were doing what kids do during Christmas break, looking for adventure. They had gathered at the base of a sandstone cliff adjacent to the Quail Hollow Ranch near Ben Lomond in Santa Cruz County, California. It was the kind of gray, damp winter day that Northern California does so well. Fog had swept across the ridge that morning, and even though the rain had stopped after weeks of steady downpours, everything was still wet. The ground was damp. The rocks were slick. The air itself felt heavy with moisture. The cliff rose about 200 feet, 61 meters above them. Not a massive face, but tall enough to be impressive to a group of kids looking up at it. And about 5 feet, 1.5 meters from the top, carved into the sandstone by centuries of wind and water, was Cat's Cave. It wasn't really a cave in the traditional sense. It was what cavers call a shelter cave, basically a rock overhang, a shallow indentation in the cliff face about 3 feet, 0.9 meters deep. Nothing spectacular, nothing that would make it into any guidebook. Just a little hollow in the stone where you could sit and look out over the valley below. Local kids had been climbing up to it for years, carving their names into the soft sandstone, claiming their small piece of immortality in the rock. The 7 kids were having fun at the base, laughing and talking, probably telling each other stories about school or friends or whatever 14-year-olds talk about when they're trying to avoid going home. They were collecting fossils from the base of the cliff. The sandstone was full of them. Ancient remnants of creatures that lived when this whole area was underwater, millions of years ago. At 4 p.m., as the winter sun was already starting to think about setting, 2 of the boys decided to climb up to Cat's Cave. Sean Carson was 14 years old. Steve McGovern was 12. They scrambled up the cliff face. Not a difficult climb, really, just picking your way up the sandstone, finding handholds and footholds, the way kids do when they're not thinking about how far they could fall. They reached Cat's Cave and pulled themselves into the shallow shelter. From up there, about 200 feet, 61 meters above the ground, they could see everything. The trees, the other kids below, looking like toys, the fog rolling in across the ridgeline. It must have felt like being on top of the world. Sean had brought something with him, a claw hammer, and he had a plan. He was going to do what generations of kids before him had done, carve his name into the ceiling of Cat's Cave, leave his mark, prove he'd been there. He raised the hammer and started pounding on the sandstone overhead, chipping away at the soft rock, creating letters. making noise that echoed off the cliff face. Steve watched, took a turn for himself too. Just two kids, hanging out in a shallow cave, doing something that seemed completely harmless. At approximately 4:15 p.m., there was a rumble. Not a loud crash, not an explosion, just a rumble, a low, grinding sound that came from the rock itself, like the mountain clearing its throat. And then the front upper portion of Cat's Cave's ceiling, about 2 feet, 0.6 meters, of sandstone that had been hanging above their heads, let go. Sean Carson was buried completely. One moment he was there, hammer in hand, probably mid-swing. The next moment, he was under tons of rock. The sandstone slab that fell wasn't small, it was massive, heavy. The accumulated weight of ancient compressed sand that had been slowly weakening for years, held up by nothing but its own structural integrity and luck. Steve McGovern was buried up to his chest. He could move his arms, he could breathe. But from the chest down, he was pinned under debris, trapped in what remained of the shallow cave, and he started screaming. The 5 kids at the base of the cliff heard it immediately. Steve's voice, high-pitched and terrified, calling down to them from 200 feet, 61 meters up. They looked up and saw the cloud of dust, the changed shape of the cave entrance, and understood instantly that something terrible had happened. 3 of them started climbing immediately, scrambling up the cliff face as fast as they could, not thinking about safety. Just knowing their friends needed help, the other 2 turned and ran, sprinting toward the nearest house to call for help, their feet pounding on the damp ground. The call went to the Ben Lomond Fire Department. A rescue squad was dispatched. They arrived at the scene in 10 minutes, remarkable response time, but when someone is buried under tons of rock, every second counts. Every heartbeat matters. The 3 kids who'd climbed up had already started trying to free Steve by hand, pulling at rocks, moving debris, working frantically. When the firefighters arrived, they brought equipment and experience, and they worked with controlled urgency, knowing that somewhere under all that rock, Sean Carson was buried completely. 5 minutes. That's how long it took to free both boys once the rescue squad arrived. 5 minutes of moving rock, piece by piece, careful not to cause another collapse, not to hurt the victims worse than they already were. Steve McGovern, the 12-year-old who'd been buried up to his chest, was uninjured, not a scratch on him. The rocks had fallen around him in just the right way, pinning him but not crushing him. When they pulled him free, he was shaken, terrified, probably in shock, but physically, he was fine. Sean Carson was under 2 feet, 0.6 meters of debris. When they finally uncovered him, after those 15 minutes of burial, 5 minutes of the initial firefighter response, plus the 10 minutes before they arrived, he had no pulse. He wasn't breathing. The firefighters had brought a Stokes litter, a rigid rescue stretcher designed for extracting victims from difficult terrain. They carefully placed Sean's body in it, lifted it over the edge of the cliff, and carried him down. An ambulance was waiting. They transported him immediately to Community Hospital in Santa Cruz, the medics probably working on him the entire way, doing CPR, trying to force his heart to start again, trying to make his lungs remember how to breathe. But when they arrived at the hospital, the doctors who examined Sean Carson declared what the firefighters had probably already known up on that cliff. The 14-year-old boy who'd been hammering his name into the sandstone, who'd been laughing with his friend just minutes before, who'd probably been thinking about what he was going to have for dinner that night, was dead. The official cause of death was straightforward: blunt force trauma and asphyxiation from being buried under rock. But the real question wasn't how Sean died. It was why the cave collapsed in the first place. Cat's Cave had been there for centuries, probably millennia. Kids had been climbing up to it and carving their names in it for decades. What made December 29th, 1980 different? The investigators who examined the scene afterward pieced together several factors. First, the weeks of preceding rainfall. Northern California had been getting hammered with winter storms, and all the water had been seeping into the sandstone, working its way into every crack and crevice in the rock. Sandstone is porous. Water doesn't run off it like it would off granite. It absorbs into the stone, and when it does, it changes the rock's properties. It makes it heavier. It makes it weaker. Second, the morning fog that had swept the ridge, more moisture, the dampness that made the ground damp, that made everything feel wet and cold, had also penetrated into the ceiling of Cat's Cave. The rock was saturated, weakened, holding more weight than it was designed to hold. Third, and most critically, was what Sean had been doing: the hammering, the pounding on the ceiling of the cave. Every blow of that claw hammer sent vibrations through the sandstone. Every chip he knocked loose changed the structural integrity of the rock above him. And that ceiling was already stressed, already weakened by moisture, already on the verge of failure. He didn't know. How could he have known? Kids had been hammering names into that cave for years, but caves don't fail gradually. They fail suddenly. 1 minute the rock is holding. The next minute, it isn't. There's no warning, no groaning or cracking that gives you time to get out of the way. Just a rumble, and then tons of stone falling at the speed of gravity.